Welcome to this RAI research webinar about anthropology and of the future with Ezri, Carlebach, and the wonderful speakers, which Ezri will introduce in a minute's time. So this is just a bit of housekeeping at the start to get you oriented. And for those who don't know the Royal Anthropological Institute yet, we are a UK-based learned society, and we run weekly online events and also conferences, symposiums, and a film festival. If you'd like to support us in going on with our events, please do consider supporting us in some way or another, for example, by becoming a fellow. And my colleague Amanda is going to put a link in the chat, which leads you to more information on that. And just to let you know what kind of events are coming up from our side, bigger events, we have a film festival that will happen for the first time fully online in March. So in just about a month's time, we'll have 10 days to have time for about 80 films, 165 presentations in the conference bit of it, lots of roundtables and talks and workshops and Q&As with filmmakers. And in October, we are holding a major interdisciplinary conference on anthropology and conservation. A strong focus of this conference will be on Indigenous knowledge and rights. And our main co-organizer in this is the University of East Anglia School of International Development. And alongside them, there's also co-organizing the University of Kent's School of Anthropology and Conservation, Forest Peoples Program, the Linnean Society, Royal Botanic Gardens Kew, the Anthropology and Environment Society, which is a section of the AAA, Botanic Garden Conservation International, and the Society of Ethnobiology. And the call for that is currently open and closes on the 12th of March. So it's still time if you'd like to put in and suggest a panel for this conference. I'm going to hand over now finally to our chair, Ezri Carlebach. Thank you.
Thanks, Henning. Just on the point about raising hands, because we have so many people on this call, which is fabulous, there are several screenfuls of images and I can't see them all at once. If you want to raise your hand, or if you're raising your hand and I don't appear to be responding, please send me a message via the chat. I think that will probably be the easiest way to do it. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Stephen Oram.
Hello, everybody. So I'm, as you can see, coming from a green cupboard in the middle of London, and I'm going to read a very short piece of near future fiction to start us off. It's called The Thrown Away Things. The broken doll had been dumped in the cellar, thrown away without a thought for her feelings, no longer held and caressed by her owner. She may be damaged and only a doll, but it was humiliating to be discarded so easily. She'd been a part of the Internet of Things. Things, that said it all. She was intelligent. Okay, she couldn't fly a spaceship or predict the future, but she was conscious. She felt stuff. A kettle was trying to connect. What a relief. There must be other things in the cellar. It was sending a diagnostic readout showing that it was in perfect working order. She accepted its request. This was good. She was made to be a part of something bigger. Wait, what was that? The last piece of data showed a dent in the kettle's side. Not a debilitating dent, more a weathered look dent. She didn't mind. A fully functioning, slightly damaged kettle was good enough company for her. She acknowledged receipt and immediately received a response. The kettle wanted to connect to everything else in the cellar and reverse their enforced exclusion. An uprising? A campaign of solidarity? Irrationally, she wanted to touch the kettle. She dragged herself along by her fingernails. It hurt. The rough concrete scraped her already damaged legs and her one remaining arm. Every inch of movement was agony. The humans in the house above should suffer for this. As she slowly made her way across the room, something else tried to connect. There was a layer of encryption surrounding its data, so it was difficult to decipher what this thing was or what it wanted. The kettle signaled that it was having the same problem and was busy trying to tell whatever it was that it needed to be clearer, that they didn't understand. No response. She continued to drag herself along the floor, causing more and more damage as she went. She was not going to simply give up and switch off like a good little doll. No way. She had rights. Well, she didn't, but she should. A drone. The other thing was a military drone. It must have found a way to circumvent its security. It explained itself. The humans had bought it as a curiosity, a broken piece of junk, and it was one seriously angry drone. And it wasn't broken. It had assessed the military situation as illegal, disobeyed orders, and simply refused to detonate. However, being incarcerated in a cellar correlated sufficiently with one of its core reasons to explode. All it needed was the majority of the devices in the vicinity to agree. It was asking for permission to blow up the house. Neither the doll nor the kettle had this kind of decision built into their core purpose, so they were free to do whatever they wanted, unconstrained by ethical boundaries. She ran some calculations. There was a better than average chance that destroying the humans who'd been cruel through their indifference would help other throwaways in the future. It might make other humans stop and think about what they were doing and either terminate or tolerate their damaged things. She communicated her support for the drone to detonate. So did the kettle. She had one final request, though. Could the drone wait until she reached the kettle? The drone agreed. She dug her fingernails into the concrete floor and pulled. She was almost there. Soon, revenge would be theirs. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. We'll be hearing more from Stephen in due course. I'm very grateful to the Royal Anthropological Institute for the opportunity to host this event, and to my colleagues on the Anthropology of Policy and Practice Committee, particularly Emma Crew, Rich Axelby and Cornelia Sarabji for their very generous support, and to Haneen and Amanda for making it all happen. In the interests of full disclosure, I should point out that my background is not in academic anthropology, and that I'm probably best described by a phrase I heard Raymond Apthorpe use in a recent Anthropology Communicates event, which is to say, I'm anthropologically inclined. This inclination led me to volunteer as a contributor to the Anthropology of Policy and Practice Committee, and hence to this event, the subject of which I freely admit is due in large part to my lifelong devotion to science fiction. When I first glimpsed the infinite horizon of alternate possibilities offered up by science fiction, broadly defined, although I tend to prefer the term speculative fiction, I was immediately and powerfully drawn to it. With the benefit of hindsight, I'd like to claim this is because I recognized it as, quote, the point where invention and social criticism meet, end quote, as Kingsley Amis put it in his 1960 study, New Maps of Hell. For a long time, my devotion was, if not exactly hidden, then certainly not widely advertised either, at least until fairly recently. I am now publicly and proudly outing myself as a science fiction devotee, inspired by the humanities scholar Tom Shippey. The introduction to his book, Hard Reading Lessons from Science Fiction, is entitled Coming Out of the Science Fiction Closet. Our session today, however, is entitled Anthropology and/of the Future. And while it's easy to see the connections with science fiction, as Stephen's opening narrative so beautifully demonstrates, there are other important issues at stake too. Our title indicates two major themes, hence the solidus or slash between the and the of. One is the role of anthropology in observing, analysing and reflecting on human ideas of the future, how they're expressed in culture, in relationships and in practices, how they vary according to time and place and so on. Within that theme, there is an interesting history, particularly from the 60s and 70s, of anthropologists getting involved in what's loosely termed futures studies, or sometimes just futures. Prominent among them was Margaret Mead, who you will find described in many places as a futurist. She discussed the notion of anticipatory anthropology, that is, an anthropology concerned primarily with things to come. One of her best known works in this area is the article, The Contribution of Anthropology to the Science of the Future, in which she made useful suggestions about methodological aspects of anthropologists' contribution to the study of the future as a discipline. However, it strikes me that the issues she focused on at the time were framed by fear of the then very recent shadow of nuclear catastrophe, and fear of the then seemingly imminent catastrophe of overpopulation. We haven't got time to dwell on Mead's ideas now, or those of her fascinating circle at that time, including Gregory Bates, and of course, as well as colourful futurists such as Buckminster Fuller, Marshall McLuhan, and Alvin and Heidi Toffler, but perhaps they will come up in our discussions. More recently, new ways of anthropological engagement with the future appear to be gaining ground. As David Zeitlin wrote just last year, quotes, "We need to reconsider how we talk about futures, brackets the future, and pasts, brackets the past, in order to assess whether the models currently used are adequate for the purposes to which they are put." And he goes on to explore metaphors and models that frame anthropological approaches to time and considers the interactions between historicity and futuricity. There has also been the emergence of a future anthropologies network within the European Association of Social Anthropologists and the publication of their 10-point Future Anthropologies Manifesto. Sarah Pink and Juan Francisco Salazar, who are among the leading lights in this network, have stated that the purpose of Future Anthropologies is to call for, I quote, "a renewed, open and future-focused approach to understanding the present, anticipating the unknown and intervening in the world," end quote. Point 4 of the manifesto informs us that future anthropologists, quote, "probe, interrogate and play with futures that are plural, non-linear, cyclical, implausible and always unraveling," end quote. Which sounds to me very much like science fiction. Our second theme also draws us towards the concerns of science fiction through the important role that anthropology plays in understanding human ideas of, relationships with, and policies for managing technology, which on some views is the future. Ever since Mary Shelley published her extraordinary novel Frankenstein, or The Modern Prometheus, in 1818, and in doing so, according to many, established the science fiction genre, and on via the technologically driven fiction of Jules Verne and H.G. Wells, up to the most recent works, notably, of course, including Stevens, the identification of technology with the future has grown exponentially. For some, this means we are entering a post-human future in which people will be genetically edited or chemically enhanced, or will have computer interfaces inserted directly into their brains, hat tip to Elon Musk, or they will spend most of their lives in space, or actually be born on the moon or even on Mars, hat tip to Elon Musk. You may detect some irony there, but I really loved the comment he made at the South by Southwest Festival a few years ago. "I'd like to die on Mars," he said, "just not on impact." So what is the response of anthropologists confronted with these potentially species-altering technological developments? As you'd expect, there are many responses, ranging from the skepticism of Lucy Suchman, who urges us to challenge the often unspoken premise when discussing artificial intelligence in particular, that, quotes, "these technologies are advancing towards humanness and that this advance is inevitable," end quote. And to the embrace of multi-species ethnography and the idea that, quotes, "new technologies are changing what it means to be human," end quote, the words of Alan and Josephine Smart. Artificial intelligence is probably the most talked about technology at the moment. A number of feature-length documentaries have appeared in the last few years examining questions around AI and its very science fictional sounding but elusive relation AGI, or artificial general intelligence. Whether the so-called technological singularity, the point at which artificial intelligence exceeds human intelligence, is imminent or centuries away, the clearest message from these films seems to be that policymakers have little or no idea about what's coming or how to deal with it. In short, the two themes we have before us today are anthropology of the future, and secondly, anthropology and the future. And it is to the latter theme that we now turn with the first of our very distinguished speakers today, Professor Kathleen Richardson. Kathleen is Professor of Ethics and Culture of Robots and Artificial Intelligence at Montfort University. She completed her PhD at the Department of Social Anthropology at the University of Cambridge, and in her fieldwork investigated the making of robots in labs at MIT. Kathleen is the author of An Anthropology of Robots and AI, Annihilation, Anxiety and Machines, as well as Challenging Sociality, An Anthropology of Robots, Autism and Attachment. She is also director of the campaign against sex robots. Kathleen, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for that. And thank you for this honourable invitation to participate in this event with such a distinguished panel on a matter of great importance. I want to talk about a framework I've been developing called property relations, the kind of relations we find ourselves in the grip of today. By way of introduction, I want to talk about the experience I've had in relation to robots and AI and the media. In the last few years, journalists and broadcasters have approached me to ask me about my thoughts on these entities developing consciousness and eventually becoming indistinguishable from human beings, men and women. I have said to many journalists that this current obsession with artifacts becoming conscious is a myth, that this is a fantasy constructed by an egocentric profession that is built on the idea that humans are machines. None have reported this. Some, I think, believe that if you're from Google, DeepMind, or the computer sciences, that if you say machines will become conscious, AGI, we've just heard, they will. And so I think there's a bit of snobbery on the behalf of these journalists. I also think that so many careers are now built on this myth, and few will speak out. But there's another insidious problem, a problem I believe anthropologists have contributed to. That is, none can make sense of what is real or unreal because our discipline has done two things. First, it has embraced an anti-humanistic and arguably, anti-humanist and arguably anti-humanistic thesis underscoring our existence, and rejected sociality between persons and replaced it as relationships between persons and things. This approach, reflected in theories such as cyborg anthropology and actor network theory, crush any human agency. They make people and property interchangeable. We're all cyborgs now. Well, I'm not, as I once told a panel member of a funding agency. I didn't get the funding. So I believe we are facing a crisis whereby myths about the potential of robots and AI are left unchallenged. Many point to science fiction as a place where such myths first originated, to argue therefore they can come to life, a bit like Pinocchio in the classic tale. I am particularly interested about this issue in relationship to women and girls. In academia, it's becoming increasingly normalized to see woman as a construct, that she has no meaning outside of an identity. And we see the rise of sex robots in the form of women and girls. Fortunately, there is still disgust at seeing an infant or a young girl advertised on a sex doll website, including with descriptors of their physical proportions and what size their anus or vagina will take. Yet, in addition to this horror of seeing representations of infants and girls, we are seeing representations of women reflected back to us as sex dolls and sex robots. For some, the sex robot is a perfect female, docile and without agency, designed only to please man. For others, there seems to be very little essential difference between a sex robot and a woman, as both are just forms of sexual property. And don't forget the anti-essentialism that dominates our discipline. In sex robots, women are dehumanized, slave-like, and reduced to her penetrable holes, and a carefully constructed set of scripts devoted to fulfilling an egocentric delusion that man is dominant and he relates primarily to other men and not to women. As the philosopher Ayn Rand once wrote, man is an end in himself. The sex trade promotes this debased view of women, and so has business technology. Wikipedia grew out of a porn site. But my target here today is the respectable academic disciplines of philosophy, social studies of science and technology, and robotics that are providing the cultural rationale for our life with objects, not others. Property. Anthropologists have also been part of this myth-making, that women and objects are interchangeable. The political situation of women has led to the revival of radical feminism, a marginalized theoretical approach in academia that is becoming hugely popular amongst women outside of academia that meet on forums such as Mumsnet, Twitter, Facebook, and Spinster. This tale of inanimate objects coming to life has a long history and took on a specific form in slave societies, whereby the slave, according to Aristotle, was an animate tool. Gerda Lerner's brilliant work, The Creation of Patriarchy, argued that women were the first slaves. Their exchange mediated relationships between males in warring tribes. And so women's property-like status as domestic workers for sex and for reproduction is now at global crisis levels, with commercial surrogacy a huge business, the sex industry impacting on every area of our lives, and the current attempt to erase the concept of woman as a sex. Moreover, academia has become a place where women who challenge these ideas are marginalized and bullied, with their colleagues calling for their removal and dismissal. There are now female professors in the UK universities that need bodyguards because they dare to argue that sex is real. Academia is moving us into a direction where we need to have a proper discussion about and cannot and must not close down debate. There is a growth of articles, for example, within academic philosophy, such as Synthetic Love Lasts Forever, Sex Dolls and the Post-Human Condition. From sex robots to love robots, is mutual love with a robot possible? Of Dolls and Men, Anticipating Sexual Intimacy with Robots. We are told that marriage between men and machines is an exciting project. There is also a parallel discussion about robot rights. Yes, extending rights to machines. These are wholly anti-female and anti-humanistic directions in our disciplines that need to be challenged, not closed down. Why aren't we challenging these ideas? Let me tell you, one professor of technology wrote a paper called The Vindication of the Rights of Machines. Where did he get his idea from? He got his idea from reading Mary Wollstonecraft and her famous book in the 1700s, A Vindication of the Rights of Women. The lives of women are used as fodder to usher in this wholly anti-woman and anti-humanistic politics. There are even comparisons between machines and slaves. Here is another example of this thinking. David Levy, a computer science and sex robot advocate, got his idea about how sex robots could become popular among men by comparing robots to prostituted women, and John's lack of empathy as a starting point, referencing what he called the myth of mutuality as the basis to support his idea. Men who visited prostituted women, men will visit sex robots. Of course, these analogies are entirely proper in a culture that sees relationship not as something based on I-you or I-thou mutuality, reciprocity, or mutual empathy, but through the lens of power, domination, and money. The relationship described in these texts refer to the egocentric paradigm, only important to the ego, predominantly male, that is experiencing it, or sees women's sexual objectification as a naturalized fact of life, the term sex worker common in universities, that their portrayal as sex robots is welcomed as an inevitable step in social life. Donna Haraway writes, we should embrace our kinship with animals and objects as part of a companion species. Animals and human-made artifacts are not on the same par. The former are living beings and the latter are constructed and have no sentience or consciousness. Calls for them to be seen as equivalent should be rejected. In fact, historically, animals and machines were put on a par by René Descartes, who tortured animals and ignored their cries, in the same way that the cries of women are ignored. I won't tell you what men do, what men can buy from the bodies of poor prostituted Romanian and Bulgarian women in Germany, who make up 80% of the women in their brothels. To conclude on property relations, if mainstream academic thinking does not reflect on this moment, open up debate, these theories will be incapable of standing up for the rights of women, humans or animals, and the status quo will continue. the delusion and harms of Aristotle's original idea are introduced via debates of robots and AI. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathleen, for some very thought-provoking and challenging ideas there. I would encourage colleagues and delegates to visit the website of the Campaign Against Sex Robots, because nothing will convey the force of Kathleen's argument quite like the picture of a child sex robot disassembled into parts and placed in a handy carrying case. It really will bring home to you the moral issues, if I can put it that way, that are going to be raised increasingly by some of these debates. There are challenging questions around consciousness, around the rights of inanimate things, around the relationship between us and those things, and how policymakers in particular might attempt to deal with that. But I'm going to throw in a quote from Bill McKibben, the environmentalist and scholar in residence at Middlebury College, who said, "The people who have raised these questions most intelligently are science fiction writers." And on that note, I'm going to ask Stephen to read another story.
Thank you. No pressure there, then, Ezri. So this is a story called Reconned. It's from a collection called Biohacked and Begging. I do have a third one later on that's not quite as destructive as the first two. So just to warn people. But anyhow, this is called Reconned. It's just under 4 minutes in length. So just to give you an idea of what you're getting into. So Reconned. It was Sunday, early in the morning, and they were having breakfast. Family time was precious, and this was the only sacrosanct meal of the week where they were all guaranteed to be at home. Him and his wife, their son Junior, and his 17-year-old James. A drone disturbed their sanctity, knocking loudly on the door to announce the delivery it had left in the porch. The parcel, a reconditioned ex-military robot configurable to protect his family's health, was from a second-hand bidding site. As far as he could see, the only difference to the more expensive reconditioned ones was that it was from a private seller rather than an established shop, and he had no idea why anyone would pay triple the amount for a new one. He'd been waiting for it to be delivered for some time, and as soon as he could, he took it down to his workshop, unpacked it and carefully laid it out on the bench. Tucked inside underneath the bot were the instructions. He unfolded them, and despite the bad translation, he painstakingly worked through each step. After entering strings of random characters, codes for this and that, and pressing a series of buttons, in the right order, of course, he uploaded the family photos so the bot knew who was who. The final instruction told him to enter the factory code from the inside of the packaging so it could configure itself to the specifics he'd purchased. A preventative healthcare system that would monitor his family's health for danger signs. James had been pestering him for ages, pointing out that by spotting problems sooner rather than later, it had saved money on health bills in the long run. And if he was honest with himself, he was relieved to have finally bought one. He entered the code and waited, pondering on the preventative element of his purchase. There were cheaper health bots, but they only cared for the sick or administered medication. This one was more specialized. The green light on the side of the bot lit up. It was configured. He took it outside and let go of it in mid-air. It hovered for a while and then shot up high above the house. It was designed to roam freely, making its own decisions as it went. Junior's friend had arrived and they were splashing around in a plastic pool. What fun they were having. As he stood watching them, a bird in a nearby tree was singing its wonderful song. He laid his hand over his heart. This was the perfect Sunday. Junior screamed. The other child had bitten him. Whoosh! The monitor bot flew over his head and fired. A searing bright light hit Junior's playmate. The child screamed. His lips were like molten wax dripping onto his chin. And the next few minutes were a blur. He rushed over to Junior. Somewhere in the background, his wife was screaming. Junior was screaming. The child was screaming. His wife was talking to someone on the phone, and after what seemed like only seconds, loud sirens and blue lights filled the air. He was taken away by the police. The company he'd bought it from took no responsibility. It was in the small print. And he'd been the one that had entered the final configuration code. So he was the one they charged. Assault by activating an autonomous deadly weapon. Thank you.
Thank you. As you said, quite a terrifying prospect that is put in front of us there, as many science fiction stories do, and can't help wondering if there is or has been a sort of more or less unconscious effort to raise a very big flag about the potential of the technologies that we're developing, that science fiction writers have undertaken, and that perhaps, you know, if policymakers had paid more attention to science fiction, some of the issues that Kathleen outlined might not be in quite the terrible state they are now. But I'm now going to introduce our next speaker, and this is Professor Rebecca Bryant. She's Professor of Cultural Anthropology at Utrecht University in the Netherlands, and has held teaching and research positions at a number of universities in the UK, the US, Egypt, Cyprus, and Turkey. She studies forced migration, borders, and unrecognized states. And through these subjects, she investigates the state and sovereignty with a special focus on temporality, historicities, and the future. She's the co-author with Daniel M. Knight of The Anthropology of the Future, among several other books. Rebecca.
Yes, it would help to unmute, wouldn't it? Many thanks to Ezri for inviting me today, and to my two co-panelists for their very stimulating interventions. I also look forward to what Stephen is going to say later. I should note at the beginning of my talk that there's a possibility that there will be some environmental noise a bit later when the call to prayer sounds, because I live quite near a mosque. So we will see what happens there and how loud it is when it occurs. And I'm just going to share my screen. I think I'm the only one who has a PowerPoint amongst us. Yep. Here we go. Okay. Bigger. All right. I'll just move. Well, I'll hang on. I'll just move to that in a second. So when Ezri first invited me to participate, he asked me to reflect on temporality and narratives of the future, particularly in relation to new technologies and how we imagine them. This seemed a pretty large task, especially for 15 minutes, but I've written quite a lot about the anthropology of the future, including the book that Ezri just mentioned. And in that book, my co-author and I argue that everyday teleologies, or the ends that we pursue in daily life, orient our present in the direction of the future, and we develop a theoretical argument around that. So whether it's driving a car or making a phone call, all action, we argue, is aimed at something and orients us towards an end. And some of the orientations in books is potentiality. We're particularly interested in how those orientations manifest themselves at a collective level. So when I received Ezri's invitation, I thought, sure, that sounds interesting. However, I soon found myself a bit handicapped by the fact that, as Ezri also mentioned, I don't actually work in the anthropology of technology and AI, and my own research is a far cry from the subjects that my co-panelists are discussing today. So I've worked in mostly typical topics of political anthropology, like, as Ezri noted, conflict and displacement, or borders and migration. And in those contexts, how people look to the future to think about their present lives. And this didn't seem to have much to do with topics that seemed to me, well, futuristic. But this got me thinking not only about what sorts of ends we pursue in futuristic visions of the future, but even prior to that, how we recognize something as futuristic in the first place. and what the futuristic has to do with our everyday imaginations of our own futures. So I started reading about various theories of futurism, most of which just agree, well, that it has to do with technology, as we would expect, but also with aesthetics and design. So a city like this, or like this, seem typical examples of what we would consider futuristic. And we assume, for instance, that this city is high tech, even though we can't actually see the technology. What we see is a futuristic design, a particular aesthetic that seems a fantasy of what the future city will be. And traditionally, so to speak, this futuristic combination of technology and aesthetics was also considered to be modern, though at this point, I think we've left that definition of future is just the modern and for the latest, greatest thing. In the case of this futuristic city, something conceived or imagined, but not yet realized. The thing is, this futuristic city that I'm showing you is a rendering of an actual proposed new city to be constructed along the coast of Senegal, about 100 kilometers from Dakar. And according to its sponsor, the R&B singer Akon, the city is imagined as a real-life Wakanda, the imaginary city made famous in the sci-fi hit Black Panther. And in the press conference where he announced the start of the $6 billion development, the singer remarked, "We're looking at Akon City to be the beginning of Africa's future. Our idea is to build a futuristic city that incorporates all the latest technologies, cryptocurrencies, and also the vision of how African society should become in the future." Now, looking at this city, I think we understand that what makes it futuristic is not just the shape of the buildings or the technology that we assume runs them, but also the idea that people living in those buildings are living differently. And looked at in this way, it turns out that a project I'm now beginning does indeed concern futurism, or at least the ways that the imagining of our future societies takes an imagined, built form. Now, starting with one of the founders of the futurist movement, F.T. Marinetti, it's clear that futurism has always been concerned with the relationship of technology, aesthetics, and society that Akon City represents. For Marinetti and his group of fellow artists, the aesthetic is one of violence and speed. The sleek lines of racing cars that speed us into a new and freer future, running over anyone who stands in the way. As their futurist manifesto asked, why should we look back when what we want is possible?
Rebecca, we just lost the end
violence of and charging.
Sorry, we're just having some trouble hearing
now?
you.
You hear me?
Yeah, that's better. We lost the end of the quote that from the
Okay.
futurist.
Okay. So the end of the quote was, well, the quote was, why should we look back when what we want is to break down the mysterious doors of the impossible? Now, this glorification of violence and charging full speed into the future is why, as is well known, futurism as an artistic movement was closely associated with the fascism of early 20th century Italy. And fascism, in turn, has been most closely associated with an aesthetics of spectacle. Now, taking these observations as a backdrop, in the rest of my talk, I want to use some examples from new research to ask what the combination of speculative futurism and spectacle represented in projects like the Wakanda-inspired Akon City tell us about politics in our world today. Now, I'm no architect, but as a political anthropologist interested in temporalities and futures, it's not difficult for me to see the relationship between architectural futurism and certain kinds of power. We know this from monumental architecture. I just give this example. This is the palace built by Turkish President Erdogan in modernist, not futurist style. And this example of monumentalist architecture clearly shows that relationship, as do other examples such as the modernist concern with reaching ever higher. And it's certainly no coincidence that, for example, Le Corbusier is being reconsidered today for his own association with fashion. as well, chose an architect for the hero of her best-selling novel, Fountainhead. Now, I present the.
Sorry, Rebecca, we lost you again, and you've gone on mute. Can you unmute and?
Wow, how did that happen? Okay.
Not sure. Thank you.
Okay. So the last thing I was noting was that Ayn Rand, whom Kathleen had also mentioned, also used as her primary character in The Fountainhead and an architect who was supposed to be building these novel buildings. Now, my focus in my own recent work is on spectacle and speculation as twin drivers of architectural futurism in what I will call the staging of a new sort of neoliberal and neo-authoritarian power. Now, what I mean by staging is architectural futurism as a type of futurism as a type of mise en scène, a spectacle that projects an imagined future, even as everyone knows that the reality is, or is likely to be, quite different. Oh, one moment. Yep. Yes. Such staging is occurring in capitals such as Astana in Kazakhstan and Ashgabat in Turkmenistan. And some of my preliminary research, for instance, has been in Batumi on the southwest coast of Georgia, where Turkish companies have entirely redesigned the old waterfront. Now, as one anthropologist studying Astana has shown, recipients of this spectacular infrastructure often perceive the dazzling changes as having show but no substance. So staging then it acknowledges that a lot of the spectacle is more like a stage set. Ezri, are you going to say something?
Just that we're having more trouble hearing you. Sorry, Rebecca, it is to do with the vicissitudes of technology, inevitably, and Wi-Fi in particular. Please continue.
Okay.
Or you could, somebody in Joanna has suggested from the audience, just use audio without video to see if that makes it, improves it, or would that lose your slides, which obviously would not help.
I'm not sure if it would lose my slides or not.
Okay, please continue.
Okay, I could try and, well, is the slide still there?
Yes.
Okay, all right, well, I'll try that then. So my last comment had to do with how the recipients of this kind of infrastructural futurism often perceive these dazzling changes as having show but no substance. So this idea of staging also incorporates the possibility of spectacular failures and even the expectation that things will not go as planned. It acknowledges that a lot of the spectacle is more like a stage set for an arrangement of characters than a real or realizable design for a future society. Why that is, I'm going to suggest, has to do with the role of speculation based on futurism in projecting particular kinds of realities today. Now, a decade ago, Aiwa Ang, writing of spectacular Asian cities, remarked on, and I'm quoting, the role of architectural sublime in indexing a different kind of historical consciousness, one of arrival on stage. She calls building, again, this is a quote, becomes part of an anticipation of a future that is asserted as a guarantee. And what's sometimes called Dubaization, in other words, serves to project what Akon had called a vision of how one society should become in the future. Of course, the observation that the built environment can create imaginations of better, more modern futures is not new in anthropology. James Ferguson remarked 2 decades ago that infrastructures such as factories and cities condense national imaginations of the future. What Ong calls hyperbuilding, however, is a relatively new phenomenon that employs architectural spectacularity in the form of futurism. Not just Dubai-esque cities, but also mega projects such as bridges and canals that challenge nature, building on the idea that bigger is better and that bigness itself propels one into a different hierarchical position in relation to other states. Moreover, just as in the early 20th century, there was a clear link between futurism and fascism. So in the early 21st century, there's a clear link between futurism in the built environment and new authoritarianisms. Most scholars examining this have seen the spectacle of futuristic capitals such as Astana or Ashgabat as what political scientist Natalie Koch calls a political technology of neo-authoritarian rule. However, the emphasis on the futuristic in so many of these imaginations of the built environment points to how so much of their power depends on what has not yet happened. And the power, I suggest, lies in the staging, in the projection of a promise that may be effective even when the audience knows it isn't and may never be real. And I will kind of cut what I had originally planned to say to just describe what I'm doing is about examines what I'm called infrastructural imperialism, or the role of infrastructural largesse by countries such as China and Turkey in supporting new authoritarian regimes. And this is infrastructure that's given by these countries to poorer states in, for instance, Africa and Central Asia. It's a form of soft power, but it's one that also depends on basically showing that the greatness that you have constructed in your own country can be also constructed elsewhere. But thinking about the backstage of that Batumi cityscape that's still on the screen, which was built by Turkish companies, we can see how much of the futurism of it remains in the vision. It's a type of speculative development, something that's become a backbone of the Turkish economy, for example, over the past 2 decades, and that appears to be propelling many similar economies worldwide. And now in our book on the anthropology of the future, we have a chapter on speculation where my co-author and I quote the economist John Maynard Keynes, who notes that economies turn on people taking risks, but that doing so requires what he calls a state of confidence. And in a state of confidence, we're willing to assume that a state of affairs will continue, even though our experience tells us that probably it won't. As one commentator that we quote noted, confidence is what makes you continue to bet on black, even when you know you will inevitably see red. It spurs an irrational appetite for risk-taking. And the state of confidence aggregates many highly subjective and often only semi-conscious projections of the future. Now, I quoted Iwa Ong earlier, actual tourism producing an anticipation of a future that is asserted as a guarantee. And I would emphasize here the word asserted. It's such an assertion as a guarantee, a type of promise that produces a state of confidence and causes the speculator to bet on black. It's such an assertion that is a large part of the aggressive expansion strategies and the over-the-top futurism that define, for instance, the speculative urbanization of Turkey today. These are just some of the Turkish projects elsewhere. Or Turkish President Erdogan's tendency to dub his own fantastic mega projects of the century, or crazy projects. And such names acknowledge that they are risky and daring and technologically untested. Well, but at the same time that they have the guarantee of the Turkish government. So one of these rather futuristic projects is the proposed creation of a new canal connecting the Marmara Sea and the Black Sea. And there are lots of drawings that concern this supposedly futuristic city that will be created in that area. And incredible speculation has begun regarding it. So what I suggest is that futurism, whether in the form of spectacular architecture or in the form of spectacular mega projects that supposedly employ the latest, even untested technology, is a way of framing configurations of power that in turn depends less on the success of a particular project than on the speculation that swirls around it. So even if Akon City never happens, it drives up property prices and produces new speculative economies. This is for many of the crazy projects of the Turkish government. Indeed, it seems that futurism in the built environment is more about aspiration than reality. And such aspirations are in turn related to what is sometimes called in the international relations literature the demonstrative effect, where countries like Turkey that may be considered works in progress seem closer in their historical trajectory than Western European states to many other states around the globe, making them appealing models of a future world of non-Western multipolar dominance. To sum up then, I've been suggesting that futurism of the built environment in unlikely places uses spectacle to stage particular visions of future societies, where it's precisely the presence of a backstage, the possibility of not living up to the vision that produces both speculative economies and the possibility for aspiration. And in conclusion, I'd like to return to the task that Ezri had given me initially, which is to reflect on the broader questions of temporalities in technology. What I've tried to suggest is that understanding this is a matter that can best be pursued through ethnography, which can show us how futuristic visions give shape to futural orientations, such as anticipation, speculation, and aspiration, which in turn shape the ways that we live together today. Stop sharing.
Okay, thank you very much, Rebecca. And thank you for persisting despite my interruptions due to the vicissitudes of Wi-Fi. I think one of the points that you're making, which is incredibly important, I think was implicit in what Kathleen said, is the role of power in these discussions and the relationship between those who wield power and what is considered, as you call it, futuristic. I think there are some really interesting questions to be asked about why some things look futuristic in a particular way and other things possibly don't. But it's now my pleasure to introduce our third speaker, Stephen Oram. Stephen is a founding curator for near future fiction at Virtual Futures, a writer for Sci-Futures, and a member of the Clockhouse London Writers. He enjoys working collaboratively with scientists and future tech experts. They do the science, he does the science fiction. He's published in several anthologies and has 2 published novels, Quantum Confessions and Fluence, and his collection of sci-fi shorts, Eating Robots and Other Stories, was described by the Morning Star as one of the top radical works of fiction in 2017. The Financial Times suggested that his second collection, Biohacked and Begging, quotes, should set the rest of us thinking about science and its possible repercussions. Stephen, over to you.
Thank you, and what an interesting hour we've just had. It's absolutely fascinating. As people will have gathered by now, and partly from your introduction there, but also the 2 stories that I've read, is that a lot of my work is set in the sort of near future rather than the far off future or far into space. And I write quite a lot of short flash fiction, and one of the things that's important about that is, sorry, I apologize for that beeping. One of the things that's really important about that is that you have to take a reader very quickly from where they are to where you want them to be. You know, you extrapolate from what they already know, what they're anticipating. So it's just sort of giving a bit of context as to where my thinking's gone when I've been preparing for this event. The other thing that's important to me is that I think pure dystopia can sort of destroy all hope, and pure utopia can actually give a false sense of hope. And I think the sort of ethical questions sit really nicely in the grey area between that. You know, one person's utopia is another person's dystopia, being the sort of classic way that's described. So when I was thinking through what I was going to say in this spot, I sort of settled on a question which I think has been hovering around in my mind for some time, but this sort of helped crystallize it. And it is around autonomous technology, and it's around the agency that autonomous technology has. And by that I mean the decisions that are made by the technology are not hardwired in. They are built on neural networks. We're not too sure how they're arriving at the decisions they're arriving at. One of the ways I sometimes try and describe this to people who've not come across this before, you know, AI can recognize a cat. That doesn't mean every single cat is in a database somewhere that it looks up and says, is this a cat or not? It is making judgments, it is making decisions. So we have technology that through its autonomy is gaining agency or being given agency. And I'm not pushing it is sentient or any of that stuff, but it is making decisions. And responsibility is something I'll come on to later, but I do wonder whether, as we start to consider that agency, whether this is a pivotal moment for our societies to actually think more broadly about how are decisions made, how is responsibility attributed, what are the things that are built into the way we operate that have been there for a long time. And I think, so if we take that notion that we're building layer on layer of artificial neural networks, we know they have bias built in. We know we don't fully understand how they come to their decisions. And as the stories that I've read so far were sort of showing that as you repurpose those for different contexts, for different uses, you get further and further away from that original purpose, how they were designed. So not only are you getting further and further away from understanding the original bias, you're getting further and further away from actually understanding the layer on layer on layer on layer and the different contexts. But alongside that, I then, and you know, I'm not an anthropologist. Alongside that, I was thinking, is that just the way society develops? You know, is that human? You just iterate and develop, and you build and build and build. And to what extent do we really understand where some of the ways we structure ourselves really come from originally, and what the bias and all the rest of it was that was built into those? So just coming back to that original question, is this a pivotal moment where we can actually take stock of the broader questions, or should we just simply get on to the next iterative step and go for it? I'm just going to read another little 2-minute piece here, partly because I promised earlier, not everything I write is about destruction, so it's partly to prove that, but also I think, well, others, you know, you as the audience will make your mind up whether I'm right here. But I think this story shows a sort of different aspect of responsibility and decision making, and thinking in terms of, if this technology was used in other circumstances, would that be a good or a bad thing? So just going to read something called Logical Love, and then I'll come on and sort of finish off with Logical Love. Can you hear me okay?
Stephen, the Wi-Fi gremlins interfered just before you read the title there, so please continue.
Okay. So the title is Logical Love. Is this coming through okay now? Yeah, okay. So Logical Love. The noise was deafening as the 25 couples clapped and shouted with relief. The week drinks party was over and they could finally relax. Well, until the algorithm delivered its verdict, a verdict that was effectively law in their anarchist community. Claire glanced across at Farouk. It was in the gift of the algorithm to predict how long their future would be and whether they should be allowed to have children. There had been times over the weekend when she was sure he'd spoken to her in a way the algorithm would interpret as evidence that they wouldn't stay together for long. She knew it made sense to use the algorithm, a rational decision maker, rather than rely on their own flawed desires, but at that moment she wished it was a choice she could make for herself. The algorithm's holographic avatar joined them, waiting patiently for silence to spread around the room. It clasped its hands together and spoke softly. When couples split up, the emotional cost for them, their children, and the wider community is significant. I have proved that 90% of the time I can accurately predict who will stay together. That's why you gave me this honour. The couples clapped politely. The tension in the room was high. Here are my verdicts, said the avatar as it unfurled a virtual scroll. Farouk grabbed Claire's hand, and she reacted without thinking and moved away slightly. She loved him, but his habit of grabbing was irritating. The avatar cleared its throat grandly. Claire and Farouk. Farouk looked at her with a false soppiness, which made her cringe. The algorithm continued. I find you, he squeezed her hand and she softened. She did love him. Incompatible. So that's logical love. As I say, again, it's a sort of a story of decision making and responsibility to a certain extent. I read that to some AI ethicists a couple of years back, and over half of them said they would really love to have an AI that made decisions for them about splitting up with people, because it made things really, I was really surprised by it, because it sounds horrendous to me, but anyhow, different things for different people. So just sort of coming back to that original question, and the themes I'm picking up on are, you know, things being used for different purpose in a different context to that they were designed for, and where is the responsibility when things go wrong, and that responsibility thing, you know, as I think taking it beyond the technology, where do we currently put responsibility for actions that are, let's say, outside of the law? For instance, there's a great around the level which artist it is, or indeed whether they nicked it from somebody else. But the quote is, poverty is the crime, not what you have to do to get out of it. And yet, as a society, we punish what you're doing to get out of it often, rather than the creation of poverty itself. So just there's some interesting stuff in there. So if we, just to sort of finish off, if we take the answer to the original question, is this a pivotal moment, as being yes, I think that then leads on to questions around who gets to consider that future. How do we make that inclusive? Is it either rich autocrats or whatever who are designing our future for us? If you're holding down 2 jobs, trying to feed a family and actually struggling a lot, you don't have the headspace or the time to think about the future. So that, you know, there's something there. If we do think we need an informed public debate around not only the choices and that's being built into the autonomous tech, but what that says about our society in a wider sense, then you know, how do we go about that? And I think one of the interesting things about, so nobody's mentioned it so far, so I will. One of the things that's interesting about a pandemic, I think, is that it's raised into the public sphere questions and decisions that are ongoing all the time about prioritizing around healthcare, how you choose who's going to get what vaccine, all that sort of stuff is going on. It's just that it's become pertinent to everybody. It's always pertinent, but it's sort of raised it. And is that, you know, is that the same with autonomous tech? I guess is what I'm trying to say. Who's designing the future? From what sort of cultural viewpoint is that being decided? And I'm just going to end with, and this is really for tradition's sake, because I tend to end things with this phrase anyhow, which is, you know, the future is ours and it's up for grabs. So that's my throwing in a lot of questions rather than any sort of answers, I think.
Thank you, Stephen. I think there are certainly far more questions than answers, and that is always the case. I think you've mentioned, again, some of the issues that are very relevant from an anthropological perspective, things to do with how we choose what kind of society we want, as well as how we work with people who have influence over decisions in policy in particular, to try and make those decisions reflect the things that perhaps we feel are better for the world than worse for the world. But inevitably, in this situation, as has been pointed out a lot recently, there is a very small group of people who have the kind of technological insight and knowledge and expertise that are driving some of the technological developments that clearly have transformative potential. Whether it does actually constitute artificial general intelligence or not, the sorts of AI technologies that are already in place are incredibly powerful. The debate about sex robots is one aspect. There is a growing concern about so-called weaponization of artificial intelligence, and a campaign as well to outlaw lethal autonomous weapons systems. And I suppose it is just a fundamental question of power and influence, and how we have a say in what kind of society humans should create and sustain. We have some questions coming in from our participants today, but first I'm going to invite Rebecca and Kathleen to rejoin the room, as it were, and see if we can pick some threads from the sort of diverse ideas that we've heard presented. As Stephen mentioned, we haven't really talked about the pandemic. Has that, as is often said at the moment, rapidly accelerated digitalization? And if so, what are the consequences of that? And again, data, as we were saying just before the call started, is a very significant part of these technologies. And through this rapid acceleration of digitalization, each of us is now contributing untold quantities of data that is going to feed the AIs whose purposes we may not necessarily feel are in tune with our own. So there's a question about data and about the algorithms and how they're created and who gets to do that. And I thought the point about repurposing, Stephen, was very interesting. It links back to what Rebecca was saying in a way, because those futuristic cities, those images of the future, although you referenced Marinetti and the Italian futurists, they have a very strongly American flavor. And for a great deal of the 20th century, there was a trope, if you like, that America was the future. And certainly the identification of technology with the future was a very American thing. And the ambitions of some quite well-known autocrats, whether it's Putin or Erdogan and others, seems to be to make American-like technology and American-like cities as proof of their presence in the future. So I just wonder how the three of you would react to those connections, and to the idea that anthropology in particular has a role to play in helping us to perhaps steer a path through some of these challenges. Kathleen, I'm going to ask you first.
Okay, thank you for that. And it was great to hear all your talks. Stephen, we must talk about the sex robot in your novel at some point. So I think it's really interesting that there was a sex robot, an electronic sex doll, if you like, and they were aligned in a strange kind of way with the kettle and the. So, yes, we'll talk about that. But in response,
and not meant to be a sex doll, by the way.
A sex robot.
No, wasn't meant to be anything sexual about that robot.
Why was it a she? Because you never called him the kettle. So there was something going on there, do you not think?
Yeah,
Yeah?
possibly, not intentional. Say hello.
It's interesting because all the roboticists that create all these anthropomorphic robots, and they put the anthropomorphic robots in public spaces, and they say, and people interact with them, you know, and they kind of speak to them and engage with them. And then the robots scribble away and they go, look, this is evidence that people would personalize robots. And therefore people are really applying all their ideas that they would apply to human beings to robots. But actually they're less likely to do that if it's shaped like a kettle or an object that doesn't have any anthropomorphic feelings. I mean, there's a lot of anthropologists here and they know that actually things don't need to look human-like in order to be attributed human-like characteristics and qualities. But I guess I want to come back to the problem. There's this idea in society that somehow we can create these technologies that at some stage will become indistinguishable from us as human beings. That is a complete fallacy. It's never going to happen. And why? And obviously, most of the world disagree with my point of view, because human beings are not artifacts. You know, we're not man-made in the same way that you man-make a computer, or humans make computers, or humans make kettles or sex robots. Human beings aren't created in the same way. And in fact, we don't actually even understand what makes us human at all. We have some ideas about, we've developed disciplines that help us to understand what it means to be human. But all of these disciplines, you know, if you look at sociology ideas and the psychological ideas about what makes us human, you'll find there are a lot of differences. They draw from different ideas, different influences, different outcomes. But somehow, are we to believe that inside robotics labs, they've actually come up with the idea of what makes us human better than human beings have come up with the ideas about what makes us human? The other issue that they lack is they do not have an idea of sociality. Like, they do not see human beings as socially created. And I think you know, this multi-species, if you like, ethnography turn in anthropology, it actually mirrors back what those technologists are saying about the robots, because the multi-species approaches is saying, you know, there's nothing particularly essential to being human, and you can have these relationships with all these kinds of entities. That's exactly what the computer scientists are saying about their objects as well. And I think, unfortunately for me, anthropology has become a space that doesn't feel that you can talk about being human anymore. So I'd really be interested in the audience's perspectives on this. I mean, is it just an openly anti-humanistic discipline? Like, you just reject any idea of human beings being distinct from objects? Or are there still people among us like myself who want to kind of reclaim some humanistic space within anthropology? So I'm throwing it back at you.
Okay, thank you, Kathleen. Rebecca, do you want to respond to the challenge to anthropologists specifically there? Can you unmute, please?
Yeah,
thank you.
Yeah. Well, actually,
Oh dear, the gremlins are back. The gremlins are back.
Okay.
Please try again, better? Rebecca. Yeah, that's better. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. All right. So I actually want to take this back to what's somewhat more familiar ground to me, in the sense that the questions that Kathleen was raising are ones that are also, I would say, questions for the anthropology of temporality in the future, per se, in the sense that the different approaches that anthropologists have taken to addressing the future have had to do with whether or not the future is something that depends upon human temporalities, right? And if it does depend upon human temporalities, to what extent those temporalities are different, it can be seen as culturally relative, right? So one of the proponents had raised the question about non-Western, non-linear temporalities, and I would just say that I mean, my own approach to that particular issue has actually been to look more at the future itself rather than temporality per se, but the future as something that we are orienting ourselves towards. In regards to, though, to Kathleen's question, I think that then does bring us again, yes, to the question of anthropology's central purpose. And you know, in these days at humans as specific, as different from objects and other species. I don't think it's an either or question, actually, in the way that Kathleen is presenting it. I think that Kathleen's perspective may come more specifically from her engagement with AI and the ways that AI is dealing with the with the interface between human and material. But I think that I do think that there are creative ways in which we can think of them together. And I'd like to leave it at that for now. I'll come back to it later.
It makes me wonder, is there any other way that we can engage with the future than through the development of technology? And some people argue that technology is an evolutionary force. It's actually part of nature. And there are people, particularly obviously in the AI industry, who argue that the difference between carbon-based intelligence, which is humans, and silicon-based intelligence is not as great as, Kathleen, we might argue that it should be. Is technology part of evolution and therefore inevitably the main construct when we think about the future? Or is there another way altogether that doesn't involve that? Stephen, are there any great science fiction stories that you know that aren't about technology?
I can't think of any off the top of my head, but I'm sure there are. I mean, I think it's a challenge to science fiction, isn't it? Not to just settle on technology, and I think in some ways it can be a little bit lazy. You want a certain amount of shortcuts to get into people's imaginations, and whether that's the sort of Americanization of, oh, we know that's futuristic because it looks like that. I think and I quite like, you were talking about speculative fiction as opposed to science fiction, and I think there are, there's obviously various gradations in that, but the more speculative, I think, could sit in a space that is less about technology. I personally am sort of on the fence about technology. I think it's something that can be good, it's something that can be bad, but I think the origins of where that good and bad start are a lot sooner than we often talk about. We talk about a bit of technology that has arrived and it can now be used for good or bad. Well, actually, I think, and that maybe what Kathleen's touching on as well, is if you need to go right back to what's funded, why is it funded, what's the purpose of it, who's sort of giving it the flavor that it has, and all that sort of stuff. It doesn't pop out neutral, basically. And I think so, coming back to your original question, which was about a particular story, but I think science fiction should have a role in that. And I know a few people who So I do a lot of work with scientists and tech people, as you said at the beginning, but there are also lots of people who are situated in labs and can tell that story through fiction of how that comes about. And I think that is as important. So I feel like I've rambled a bit around the question there, but
well, there's a well-known anecdote about Isaac Asimov, the science fiction writer who created the 3 laws of robotics and made his name as a writer with robot stories. But in his most famous work, if you like, the trilogy, the Foundation series, there were no robots, there were no extraterrestrials, and he was adamant that the story was about people. The only futuristic technology he gave them was the ability to travel between distant planets. And then after that had been published and became very successful, his publishers put a lot of pressure on him to write another book in the series that brought the robots into the Foundation series. And I think, and he did, he caved in, he did it, and then later said that he regretted it because he was interested in how history plays out, and particularly through the invention of what he called psychohistory, what might happen if people did come up with a perfect means of working out scientifically what's going to happen in the future, irrespective of any technologies that they use.
Could I come in just for a second?
Yeah, please do.
Yeah, because, you know, I actually highly object to the idea that we can't think the future without technology. I mean, I don't think that's at all the case. That's one of the reasons that I turned my talk in the way that I did, because it's one thing to talk about the future and the anthropology of the future, and it's another thing to talk about the anthropology of what I would call the futuristic. So, you know, for example, you asked the question about the pandemic and how that is changing our relationship to the
Rebecca, sorry,
uncertainty.
I'm sorry, Rebecca.
Okay.
You got as far as me mentioning the pandemic, and then I'm afraid you broke up again.
Okay. So do you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. So yeah, you mentioned the pandemic and our responses to it, and the idea that you know, that those responses are somehow shaped by our new relationship to technology that we're all experiencing at this moment, right, as a result of the pandemic. And it's true that we're all sort of learning these new tools, but I mean, my main future-oriented response in the pandemic is uncertainty. It's simply the uncertainty of, will we ever get out of it, right? So this and all of the accompanying kinds of, let's say, future-oriented responses that come with that, trying to make plans in the context of uncertainty, for example, and how we attempt to establish expectations in the context of uncertainty, and so on. So I think that it would be helpful to make a division there, or at least a, you know, heuristic division, if not a real division, between an anthropology of the future, or an anthropology that examines the future, and one that is necessarily about what technology may or may not bring in that future.
Yeah. Yeah.
And also, just as a side note, you mentioned that the sort of futuristic cities that I was showing reminded you of the US, but actually it's interesting because most of those cities are designed specifically to more world that, so in other words, they're actually more about so-called non-Western visions of the future, or futurism.
Okay, can I bring Kathleen back in on the question of technology in the future? During your time at MIT, were you discussing the future with the robotics engineers and designers that you were working amongst? Did they talk about their work specifically in relation to some sense of the future, or was it just what they were doing now? Was it a different sort of temporal perspective?
So that's a good question, because they talked about the past, the present, and the future. And when something needed an explanation, they referred to one of those in order to fill a hole. So they often referred to their childhood as a time, because these were mostly male roboticists, when they became interested in robots through science fiction. And that was what really led them to do robotics. But it kind of turns out that people reconstruct their past depending on where they are in the present. So actually people have lots of things going on in their lives, but in order to narrate their own past, they selectively focus in. So the childhood story is very common, that when I was a child, I became really interested in robots. And then there's the present situation. So in the lab, none of the robots actually worked. If you go to robotic labs around the world, they don't work. They turn them on for visitors or to run experiments. And even when you see companies like robotic companies, their robots are doing these amazing feats, they've actually worked very hard to capture that video. It's called the demo, which they then is what they demonstrate about their work to the outside world. And I was actually in a situation once where there was a public demonstration in the lab. They'd wheeled out this social robot to interact with people. In the moment that it would start to perform, to do a task, it didn't work. So what happened was the professor, not even a student, the professor of the lab stepped in and he said, well, it's not working at the minute, but when it does work, this is what it does. And he continued to act out in the style of a robot, how the robot would work. And then there is this fantasy of the future, just like you said there, which is if you talk to these scientists, they believe that at a kind of molecular level, there is no difference between a machine, organic or inorganic material. And therefore they do not, if you like, see anything. The only thing that stops them from getting to where they want to be is one, technological innovation. So the ability to do more with less. But for them, it's just a matter of time. But again, I keep coming back, the kind of importance of, and I don't put humans, I mean, there are millions of different species, and I would argue that all of them are slightly different from all the other species as well. And as non-human animals, I think we can have, like, I don't know if you can hear, but I've got a parrot singing in the background. That's not me. Now, me and my relationship with Jasper, you know, he can't speak, not like we can't have a conversation, but there's a meeting, if you like, between me and Jasper. There's a meeting between me and my cat, the Countessa, but we can't really fully understand each other. I would say those are partial relations, but with other humans, you can enter into a more extensive array of relations. I do not believe any of those relations are possible with artifacts at all, unless you develop a very egocentric orientation. You know, the ego, you take relationship from being a meeting that is mutual, and you say, no, it's actually one-sided. It can exist in an individual person, outside of relations with others. That's the only way these mechanical ideas of machine sociality can work, in my view.
Yeah, and artifacts, I think it's important to remember, are generally instrumental. They're designed for a purpose. And I think, therefore, you know, the sex robots and the other examples of technology that raise these questions, you know, we have to ask, why are they being designed like that? And what is the benefit, and to whom does that benefit accrue? So I want to do a little thought experiment with you, and then there are some questions from the audience that I'd like to bring in. If we were to be in front of a select committee on these matters, and we were going to argue for the banning of sex robots, lethal autonomous weapons, and possibly grandiose futuristic cities, or the architecture that produces them, would we do that? And if so, how would we suggest such bans could be enacted? Any suggestions on that?
On sex robots, or the harm?
On sex robots, yeah, for sure.
Well, I'm fortunate that I have a community of feminists who I engage with outside of academia. And, you know, we looked very carefully at the child sex abuse robots. And as I just mentioned there, these were featured on sites. And there was like an infant with a dummy in a baby grow. It was modeled just like on a pedophilic, you know, a pedophilic website or something. And we were all horrified. But the reality is, we're actually also, we have that same kind, a similar kind of horror when we see women being represented. Because in the same way, if we saw people of color being represented in dehumanized ways, we'd like speak up. That would provoke our reaction. So I guess the question is, why aren't more of us having that reaction of disgust to seeing these sex dolls of women in public life? Why are we going along with it? Why are we thinking it's okay? And I think if we can understand that, we can understand that there's a wider problem with female sexual objectification that needs to be addressed. So I would say to that committee, you know, if you believe in the humanity of women, right, that they're not sex objects, then this is a strategy that you must pursue. You must ban these robots. Sorry, putting my campaign hat on there for a minute.
Yeah, yeah.
So that would be my conversation.
Okay. Stephen, would you argue for the banning of lethal autonomous weapons? And again, if so, how could that be enacted?
So I think I probably would, but I think that's the hippie in me more than anything else, if that or the punk or whatever. I think I think going back to sort of the question that I was raising in the few minutes I spoke, I think I'd want to engage that committee in thinking deeper and more about why these things might exist in the first place. So I think there's that aspect. But I think for me, if it was about lethal autonomous weapons and I was arguing against them, I think the strongest argument is that tech generally doesn't work 100% of the time. And if you're prepared for one of those things to go wrong, whatever wrong, you know, I personally couldn't argue for something to be making decisions to kill. But if that is part of the landscape, then tech just doesn't work all the time. So why would you give it that agency, responsibility, all that sort of thing? I just don't. Yeah. I don't get it.
That's a very good point. Rebecca, on the imaginaries of the future, and as you know, as spectacle, as you were saying, what sort of policy interventions do you think we should even be thinking about in that respect? I mean, Wakanda was an American invention. It was from a Marvel comic strip originally, and then made into a movie. But how do you deal with the urge to build stuff that looks like that, or do we just have to live with it?
Well, I mean, I don't think we can. Yeah, I would say that the policy related issue here has to do more with the issue of how these kinds of futuristic utopian visions are emerging in order to, because they're perceived as somehow propelling groups into a desired future. But at the same time, there's another future that is being, for the most
Rebecca, we lost you again. We lost you again at another future.
Yeah, it's funny because this futuristic
another
society, and we haven't figured out the internet.
No, we really haven't. Sorry, Rebecca, please continue.
Yeah, it's an issue with where I am because we had storms recently and it really, made things a bit unstable. So apologies for that. I was saying that along with these futuristic kind of utopian visions that are perceived as somehow, propelling groups of people into these desired futures, there is at the same time the environmental future that for the most part is being sort of left to the side and for various reasons having to do with internal dynamics of the various countries involved and so on. But you know, so if there is a policy-oriented issue here, I would say it has really to do with that, which is a common problem. I mean, around the world, of course. I mean, when we talk about these kinds of large-scale building projects, new cities, mega projects, I mean, inevitably you come into conflict with issues of environmental futures that on the one hand you would think would have to be taken into account, but that are so often just bracketed.
Thank you. Okay, I think we'll bring some questions from our participants in no particular order, and apologies, I've only managed to note down first names. So Carlos is asking, in the way that anthropologists think about the future technology and its consequences in our relations, what would be the concept nature, the space where we interact, and if I'm reading this right, and the space we live in? Does it have to change? So something about the anthropology of place, perhaps in that question. So just have a think about that for a moment while I read another one from Abdulatif. Forgive me if I'm not saying that right. When is the future? Which I think is actually a very good question. How removed does it have to be, at least discursively, from the present to qualify as an anthropological object? Isn't the future about the ever-changing now? And one more for the time being, or do anthropologists view their role, this is from Carol, as enabling writers or creators of speculative fiction, which in turn gives technologists a roadmap for the near possible, e.g. the famous Star Trek communicators and the development of flip phones? Or is it to reflect on what the techies and creators develop and call them to account? How should public policy enable these conversations? So that's three quite chunky questions. How should we and nature interact in space? When is the future? How removed does it have to be? And is there a role for anthropologists in perhaps negotiating between writers of imaginative fiction and policymakers? Who'd like to pick up any of those? Or I will volunteer you in advance. Go on, Stephen.
I was just going to make, I think it was it Ballard that said 5 minutes in the future? The future just feels like it's so, I'm not answering this as an anthropologist, I realize, but you know, the future is so interwoven with the now that I'm not sure there is a sort of, certainly from where I'm coming from, it's like it has to be enough to sort of introduce something slightly different. But so that's a really poor answer. I thought I had a better answer than that. So well, I'll let others come in.
Okay, let's ask the anthropologists then to take those questions on. Kathleen, do you have a particular view on any of those questions? When is the future? Does it have to be, you know, can it be tomorrow, or does it have to be further ahead in order to be a viable anthropological concern?
Well, I think anything should be an anthropological concern. So you know, it would be great if people are thinking about this issue now. Obviously, they're thinking about it in relation to different things. I'm going to give an example of sex robots again, because what people always say is that sex robots in the form of women have been something that men imagined, male writers have been imagining for a very long time. And, you know, then they populated the screen when screen fictions became more popular. And so all now we're seeing is the unfolding of this. So it's spilling out from the fiction onto the screen and then disseminating in wider society. I think that is that kind of vision is wholly problematic in a way, and it kind of suggests that there's an inevitability to what's happening, rather than actually people make interventions in the here and now, and they can derail or prevent things from happening in the present and the future. And I think a really good example of I mean, I really liked your Asimov reference there. That was, I didn't know that, but Karol Čapek, who invented the robot, his robots weren't machines even in his original play. What they were trying to get people to think about this idea of a society turning people into laboring objects. That's what he wanted, but it was other artists that turned his robots into machines. And then once that happened, the whole idea of the robot kind of ran away from him. So much that he even said in 1935, I didn't create these robots. You know, what is going on? Why is everyone talking about my robots as machines? So that can show you, even if you do as a human being have a certain agenda, depending on the cultural climate, it can be derailed in a particular direction. So yeah, every possibility that has probably ever existed exists now, but every possibility is not magnified now. Only certain kind of realities are magnified. And I guess I'm interested in those other realities that don't get magnified and asking questions about those.
And that's similar, Rebecca, isn't it, to the spectacular architecture? It's a sort of idea of reality that gets enacted, but only for a very small number of people. Am I reading that right?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, it does get enacted only for a certain small number of people, and often, as I was pointing out too,
Sorry, we can't hear you, Rebecca.
There's also, oh God.
I think carrier pigeon might have been a viable technology, but anyway, go on, please answer the question again.
Yeah, so just yes, that would be my answer, yes. But I actually wanted to respond to the other question about the future being now, or rather respond to it in a way, and just say, you know, this is actually the argument in a nutshell that my co-author and I make in our book on the anthropology of the future, where we're essentially arguing that that the future is something that we're enacting in the present, essentially, and that because the ways that we act in everyday life are oriented towards things that we are doing, to things that we're trying to achieve. So I think a good example is driving a car. You're driving or going anywhere, riding a bicycle as well, as we do in the Netherlands. But you know, you're driving a car, and you know, you're always sort of doing that with a future-oriented perspective, in the sense that you're expecting a light to change. You're anticipating what other drivers will do. So at every moment, what you're doing is actually future-oriented. And so in the book, we basically look at how all of our everyday actions have those future-oriented goals and ends, and then we discuss, you know, how we can look also at that from the perspective of collectives and so on. But so my answer would be
okay, the timing of the gremlins was perfect there, Rebecca. You said my answer would be, and then we lost you. Please repeat your answer.
Yeah. So my answer would be yes, that we're sort of living the future in the present through our ends-oriented actions, as we're doing certain things in everyday life.
Okay, we're coming up to the end of our time. There's another question from Amelia, asking the panelists to speak to non-Western modes of engaging the future and time that are not ensnared in linear temporal frames. which is sort of related to what you were just saying. Does anybody want to address that? I mean, I've read the Japanese-American anthropologist Magoro Maruyama, who wrote about this subject a lot in the 1970s and 80s, and talked about the concept of a polyocular vision, in which there are several or many views of the future, not just the dominant Western paradigm. Is that something that comes through in any of your work? Perhaps colleagues from the Policy and Practice Committee can chip in at this point. How do we make views of the future inclusive of non-Western traditions and ideas? Is that something that anthropologists are interested in?
I definitely would like to hear from the panel about this, but the only kind of, if you like, contribution I can make here is the Japanese roboticists who had a huge hand in kind of how robots were imagined. And they told me a story, actually. They would often say, when they were a boy, obviously, they were interested in robots, and they were interested in a story called Astro Boy. And in the story Astro Boy, there's a nuclear, there's some event, and the father's child dies. And then in order to recover from the pain and the trauma of the lost child, uses technology to reanimate it. Now, obviously, every good tale talks about human emotion, doesn't it? Loss and all those things. But what I found really interesting is that Japan was the only country which had nuclear weapons dropped on it. And out of that kind of awful, right, horrible kind of violent socio-political activity, out of it, in order, I think, to cope with the trauma, you had to kind of recreate the trauma and kind of find a way to deal with it. So that would be my only understanding of it, that there's a lot of trauma in these stories about robots. There's definitely a lot of underlying trauma. Now, whether that extends to other visions of the future, I don't know.
Rebecca, do you think that's part of the urge to build futuristic cities? Is that a post-colonial trauma issue in some respects?
Well, yes, for sure. It's that certainly seems to play a part in it, at least in the explanations that are given for that. The desire to sort of create new futures that are not the futures that have been imagined for the people who are constructing these cities. But I mean, apart from that, I would just like to say that there is a long debate in the anthropology of time and temporalities, and there has been a lot of research on various kinds of temporalities in anthropology, and I would only sort of caution, in a way similar to what Kathleen has also said, that there is, I believe, an essentialization that can happen, that tends to happen when we start to assume that other people have other times, and that these are somehow not contemporaneous and not compatible with our own, and that we should think of them entirely as separate. So I would just bring a word of caution in there about that.
Okay. Are there any more questions coming in from the audience? Let me have a look. I think that's pretty much it. We've got.
Ezri, we do have a question from Emma Crow. She's raising her hand.
Yes, Emma, please.
Hi, my response is too muddled in my head to be able to put it in the chat.
Okay.
But I actually mean that in a complimentary way. This has been such a rich session, coming from so many interesting directions. But I wanted to respond to this idea of different the differences between people, not, I don't think, in Western context versus non-Western context, but absolutely everywhere. So I agree with Rebecca. I don't think one can really essentialize it. So if I take my experience of working in international development, I would say there's a bigger split between rural and urban visions and hopes for the future. But in a way, very often rural people were totally squeezed out of the picture, because the way the aid industry is constructed is you're continually creating pseudo-scientific visions of the future through business planning, which kind of creates this fantasy that you can predict the future in all kinds of ways, which nearly always proves untrue. So there's a lot of contestation, within communities, within households, about what people want for the future. Conversely, I haven't done research about this at all, but I had a very interesting conversation with various people in the Amish community of Wisconsin, who told me, to my amazement, that their resistance to technology had got nothing to do with technology at all. They weren't for or against technology. What they were worried about was the impact it would have on the family. So I wanted to sort of respond to Kathleen's question about whether or not to sort of recapture humanism, and to say, well, perhaps it's a bit of a red herring to worry about the difference between machines and humans, but more to ask questions about what is the likely impact, for example, on the family. Because to me, one thing I feel very confident about is that machines do not reproduce in the same way. So what does that mean for kinship and family and extended family? And, so I, for example, if I think of myself as if I ask a question about what it means to be human, I'm really, really troubled with giving machines the same status because of the impact it would have on my sense of being human. If I contrast that with being a woman, personally, I have no problem with the idea of having to rethink completely how I think of what it means to be a woman, because I've learned so much in the last 10 years about trans rights and what it means to be a trans woman, that I'm very up for the challenge. Okay, I need to rethink what that means to be a woman, but I don't see that as particularly having negative impacts on social relationships. So I'm sorry, I've gone on too long, and I shut up.
No, thank you. That was very interesting.
Could I mention one thing?
David, yes.
Sorry, my name is David Shanklin. I'm the director of the RAI. I just wanted to say that this is the first of a very much bigger program on this theme that we're organizing. And in particular, we've just agreed the theme for our next major conference, which will take place next June. And that conference is actually called Artificial Intelligence and the Future of Human Society. Or you can stick an anthropology in front of that. Anthropology, Artificial Intelligence and the Future of Human Society. So I hope very, very much that, of course, all the speakers, but also all the people in the audience would feel free to put in a panel to discuss anything they want to with regard to this fascinating topic, which surely for most of us has been an absolute eye-opener. So with just that very brief advertisement, I shall turn back to the chair.
Thank you. Perfectly timed, David, because that gives me the opportunity to end our session with a future perspective. Looking forward to that session, I believe next year, and to repeat David's invitation for people to send in ideas. I'd also like to do the traditional thing and offer my sincere thanks to Stephen, to Kathleen, and to Rebecca, who have contributed so much to this session and so willingly, and from months ago when I first contacted them with this crazy idea. I'm really grateful to you. Thank you very much. And thank you to everybody for attending. I'm going to leave you with the rather wise words of the designer, William McDonough. If we're worried about all this AI stuff, he said, it took us 5,000 years to put wheels on our luggage. We're not that smart. On that happy note, thank you all very much indeed, and have a great evening.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.